First question, which is a little bit off topic, but we might as well warm up to the subject. Are there substantiated figures on the total number of Ukrainians who perished in German concentration and labor camps during World War II? It's addressed to both speakers.
I don't know of any substantiated figures on the number of Ukrainians who perished or were incarcerated in German concentration camps during the war, but I am aware that there was an association, and I gather still is, of former Ukrainian political prisoners and concentration camp inmates. Professor Marunchuk from Winnipeg actually has the archival materials pertaining to that particular group, which was organized in Germany after the war. I myself, in travels across Canada, have met a few dozen, including a number of inmates of Auschwitz, complete with tattoos. So I would suggest that there were probably a few 100,000 Ukrainians who were interred, and perhaps more. How many of them died in the concentration camps, I don't believe either one of us could be any more specific on.
Question to Dr. Luciuk, maybe you should just stand by here. How many Ukrainians joined and or served in the Canadian Armed Forces and the American Armed Forces? Could you also comment on the recent article, shall I mention the newspaper? I guess Jock isn't here. In the Globe and Mail by Reg Whittaker at York University, who states that there was a major breach in Canadian immigration policy with respect to the division?
First question, how many Ukrainian Canadians served in World War II in the armed forces? I believe the estimate is somewhere between 35 and 40,000. I have no idea what the American Ukrainian figures are. Proportionally then, there were larger numbers of Ukrainians serving in the Canadian Armed Forces than any other ethnic group, save the Anglo-Celts. Now, as to the second question, Mr. Whittaker's article, I have read it. You've got me on the spot. I have replied to it. My general feeling is that there was no breach of Canadian screening procedures with regards to the Divisia for several reasons. First of all, the Canadian screening procedure, such as it was, came quite late. As I pointed out, it was done by the RCMP, it was done by the the High Commissioner of Canada to the United Kingdom in consultation with his Foreign Office counterparts. This was all took part 47, 48, 49, 50, and perhaps even a little bit later than that. The earlier screenings were done largely by the British, with some Ukrainian Canadian help, and the Soviets. And in all of that, I submit to you, if one finds no evidence of wrongdoing, after all these repeated screenings, well, after all, how much are you going to put these individuals through? So unless Mr. Whittaker, Mr. Lipman, and other individuals of that persuasion can show me evidence, and I'm quite prepared to accept any historical documentation that can be examined. To the contrary, I just think the division's history is unblemished. I don't think there's anything we can ascribe to it that is a crime against humanity. Now, as I say, and I think there is a deliberate attempt to raise this issue sporadically. It has been going on since World War II ended. And I think part of that is in the interests of a few hate mongers. There are just nuts of all cases. One of them's recently been tried. We've seen the trial of Zundel, who got what he deserved, and I suspect there are people on the left, or I don't know what you put them on the left, who deserve the same kind of treatment.
Question addressed to Professor Elliott. It seems that all East European formations were properly called, or popularly called, Ukrainians, including POWs from Central Asia. Therefore, I suppose the question means, I'm not sure about, but there, I'll read it as it is. Therefore, we still read about Ukrainians participating in liquidation of the Warsaw Uprising. I'm not sure if this is a statement or a provocation for you to reply to it directly, or...
As far as I know, Ukrainians were not involved in the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising. I have read documentation that Kaminsky troops were, and in fact, before it was over with, Kaminsky so soiled his own reputation that the Germans ended up shooting him. But as far as Ukrainians, I don't have any information as to their participation in the Warsaw Uprising suppression. I might just add briefly on the earlier questions about the number of Ukrainians who died in German concentration camps. I don't have any information on that, but I suspect that more Ukrainians died in Ostarbeiter status, and I'm certain that more Ukrainians died in German camps for Red Army POWs, but the numbers, again, I don't have.
A question to Dr. Luciuk. Did the Canadian government actually request that the Jewish Canadian Congress directly come up with evidence on the division, and they could not do it? I guess the question is, could they not, in fact, provide this evidence?
It's an interesting point that the Department of External Affairs file 232-L-40 imprints itself on my mind, was available to researchers back in 81, 82, and has since been withdrawn from circulation, and I gather is going to be used for evidence before the Deschamps Commission. In that file, there is part of the correspondence, but it's also duplicated in other files, which are thankfully still open, which indicates that the CJC, through its representatives such as Mr. Bronfman, through others writing in the media, made a whole series of allegations, very similar in tone to what we're hearing more recently. Although I do want to emphasize that Bronfman was actually a very restrained and straightforward kind of writer in his letters. He wasn't being fanatical about anything. He was just wanting to get the evidence clear. The CJC was then made these representations at a very high level, cabinet level. The cabinet deferred its decision pending further investigations. The Ukrainian Canadian Committee, KUK, then made its own representations, and again at a very high level. There was an exchange of letters between the CJC and KUK, very civil in tone, and in fact, I think unless there's evidence in the CJC archives, which I haven't seen, admittedly, I would guess that between themselves, these two organized representatives of the Ukrainian and Jewish groups in Canada came to the agreement and understanding that the division's members, and in fact Ukrainian displaced persons in general, were not guilty of war crimes. I am personally aware of the fact that some of those individuals, and I won't name them, who initiated the various series of news reports in the national media of late, not only know that, because I've seen them studying the archives and the public archives of Canada, and I've seen them buy Punchuk's book, so, you know, it's all in there. It makes you wonder why the issue is sporadically brought up. And it comes in varying forms, you know, the screening wasn't right, or, you know, the Nazi next door. And then you get the kind of hate literature level that occurred in Winnipeg where the ugly Nazi booklet was distributed widely. If these people have evidence, I think we're all agreed. As Professor Hunchak said, if you show me a real war criminal, let's prosecute him to the full extent of Canadian law in a Canadian court with all the due process of law. Ukrainians died in the Holocaust, if you want to call that Ukrainian component of the Holocaust. They died in the concentration camps. They died in the Ostarbeiter units. They died under the prosecution of the nationalist movement and so on. So we all want to see Nazi war criminals prosecuted to the full extent of the law. What we don't want is a witch hunt. We don't want a McCarthy-like phenomenon in Canada where one man stands up with a list that says 800, the next day someone stands up and says there are 3,000, and then it gets down to 28 or 218. And in all of that, to paraphrase the popular saying, where's the beef? There's no beef.
This may, in fact, be our last question, and then you will have a surprise, and that is an unauthorized coffee break and a seventh-inning stretch before we get into the big panel. This question I've rephrased, and I've taken the liberty to rephrase. I think the suggestion in this question is, it was stated that attempts were made to liberate Ukraine from Germany after the war, from 1945 to 1952, with American assistance. But due to excessive Soviet infiltration of Ukrainian nationalist groups and Kim Philby's reports to Washington, the concept was dropped. I suppose the question implies to what extent the American government was aware or was interested in utilizing the displaced persons and political refugees for their own political ends without regard to their military or political backgrounds.
I was asked to review a book on this subject, and I begged off partly because I didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, so I don't know why I'm up here saying anything. One reason I didn't take the review is because I didn't feel I could marshal enough evidence to prove or disprove the thesis of the book. But I'll say this much, that in my research on Pawns of Yalta, I did run across references, and in fact I did see one document that was addressed to General Eisenhower requesting that a group of 154 Soviet nationals who had been in German uniform be spared repatriation because it was alleged that they had important intelligence information that would be of use to the OSS, or the predecessor of the CIA. And at least in that file, Eisenhower had turned that down cold, and it was clear enough from the Yalta Agreement that he had to, at least according to his orders. But I have also, and not in documented files in the archives, read other accounts that some number, and I have no idea how many, may have been given asylum, is what it amounts to, in exchange for, quote, intelligence information, end quote. That's pretty slim in the way of answer, but I really don't have much hard and fast information on it. Maybe you have more.
I think it's clear that the governments of the West were very interested in how they might use the quote-unquote Ukrainian card in the pre-war period and in the 1939-41 period when the Nazis and Uncle Joe were friends. I don't see any logical reason why the policy of utilizing Ukrainians for the ends of the British or Americans or other governments would suddenly cease with the conclusion of World War II. I have found, again, I would probably agree with Professor Elliott, I've found traces to indicate that in fact the Canadian government had a certain end in mind when it allowed displaced persons in, and it wasn't simply to provide labor on the farms or in the lumber camps. There was a kind of desire to have a definite anti-communist core in Canada within the Ukrainian community, clearly. Members of the division that remained in England were certainly used, or exploited if you want, as couriers and as very specialized guerrilla units into Soviet Ukraine, particularly Western Ukraine, after World War II. That is also, I think, very clear, at least from the oral evidence. The archives are close to the year 2050, as I recall, so I'll be old and I'll be able to answer that question a little more completely. But it is true that the infiltration of particularly the British government by Soviet agents was so thorough that most of the individuals who were parachuted or boated back into Ukraine or walked back, because there was a small dribbling number of people who returned to Ukraine to help UPA and so on, were intercepted and promptly executed or turned. And again, I suppose if the earlier part of my lecture has anything to say to you, it's that we have to stop being dupes.
I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, we must stick to our schedule so that you don't become thoroughly exhausted by the beginning of the next panel. May I suggest that coffee is available at the back? And again, please be reminded of the tickets for this evening for the reception.